In this video, I will build the amortization table portion of the amortization project. If you haven't completed the video before this that begins the data section, you need to stop this video and go and complete the data section to this point. The important thing here is to build the first line, the initial line, and then the second line. The second line will be the same all the way to the end. Once we've built the second line, we've essentially finished this portion of the project. So let's begin with the first line. What I want is to get the date of the first payment, and that's going to be the loan origination date. If you want to make it the next month or whatever, you can do that. You'll see how to do that on here. But I'm going to use eDate. The assumption of this model is that there will be at least one payment. So this line will exist. And I'll start here with G2. It's going to be different, so I don't have to use an absolute or relative cell reference. I'll just leave it relative. I'm not going to copy this anywhere. And I'm not going to advance it by any month. So I'm just going to take the loan origination month, and I'm going to put that month in there. I have this field formatted to show the month, the first three characters of the month, and the last two digits of the year. For the loan balance, I need to start this off, and to start it off, I need to keep in mind whether the decision was made to pay at the beginning or at the end of the month. So I'm going to use an if statement equals if. I'm going to take a look at this value in D6. So if D6 equals beginning, I'll set it for beginning. If it equals beginning, that means that we made the first payment before we left the building at the point we took out the loan, so no interest accrued on the original balance. The loan balance at this point then would be the principal amount plus the amount that we paid, which is a negative number, so it's going to reduce it, plus, and you have to keep in mind one of the features we have here is the ability to make an extra payment. And that will also be entered as a negative number, and we'll get to that in a moment. That would then create the loan balance now that we're going to work on. You paid some, maybe you made a little balloon payment at the front, but it doesn't really make sense. You would have just made a down payment and reduced the principal amount anyway, but we'll just go with this. Now, if it isn't beginning, if it's end, then we need to accrue some interest to this loan balance. It's sat there for 30 days, the $150,000 in this case, sat there for 30 days and accrued interest at the monthly interest rate. So we're going to take that value in D2, type D2, I can point to it, and we're going to increase it by the periodic interest rate, in this case the monthly interest rate. Then we'll add to that our payment, which is a negative number, and any additional payment that we might have made. And that gets us our initial balance. In this column, we're going to count the number of payments that we make. And this is the first payment, so I'm just going to put a 1 in here. We'll assume that there's always going to be a first payment. The interest paid, we need to calculate what portion of what we paid was interest. So if we're, again, it depends on whether we paid at the beginning or at the end. So let's take a look at this. We'll equals, we'll use the if statement. We'll look at D6 again, and if it equals beginning, then none of the payment was interest. No interest had accrued. We just reduced the balance, the principal. On the other hand, if it was end, we need to take our principal amount and multiply it times our periodic interest rate to find the amount of interest that had accrued that made up the portion of the payment that we made. The principal payment then, fairly easy to calculate. We'll just kind of back into it. We're going to take the absolute value of our payment amount, so we'll make that positive, and then we'll reduce that by the amount of interest. That means that the remainder of the payment was principal. Now our cumulative interest, cumulative principal, this is all in period 1. So cumulative interest paid is simply going to equal interest paid. And cumulative principal paid is simply going to equal principal paid at this point. This is the first period. And extra payment, we're just going to put a number in here, but we want to format this cell. We want to use data validation to keep the user from entering a positive number in here, because we're not going to reduce that. That would essentially reduce the monthly payment that we made. We need a negative number because the payment is a cash outflow. Recall we did data validation here. We want to do the same data validation here that we did here. So we'll just copy this. And then I'm going to place my cursor here and here, because I'm going to make the second line. And when I copy the second line down, it will bring down the formatting. And I'll right click and I'm going to select Paste Special. And then I will just paste the validation portion of that cell. And then you can see if we go up here, click on Data, go over here to Data Validation, that we get this decimal value less than or equal to 0, so it's going to be a negative number. And we also get the error alert with the instructions. It's a lot quicker than typing it in again, and it ensures consistency. The message is the same. We don't have to remember what the message was and retype it. Okay, that's line 1. Now let's get started with line 2. Now with line 2, we have to consider a couple of states. First of all, if the loan is paid off, this date should be blank. There shouldn't be any additional periods. We don't want to have just a bunch of dates running down with no balances associated with them. So in the notes paid off, this should be a blank. We're going to use column B to track whether the note's been paid off or not. So we want to start this by looking at column B to see if there's a value there. If there's a value there, then this period's still in use, so we need to put a date in here. And when we do, we need to increment the previous date by a value, and that value is determined on the selection made in cell D5, which is the payment period. If it's weekly, we're going to need to increase the previous date by 7 days. If it's biweekly, 14 days. If it's monthly, we need to increase it by a full month. This is where E-date really comes in handy. If it's quarterly, then we need to increase it by 3 months, and if it's annually, we need to increase it by a year. E-date's good because it allows us to jump forward a month, whether the month has 31 days or 30 days or 28 days, 29 days, it doesn't matter. It moves it forward a month, 2 months, 3 months. So E-date's an important thing once we get to that. So to do this, we will first check using an if statement to see if we have a period in use. So see if this cell is blank, equals blank. If so, we'll enter a blank. Otherwise, we'll put an if, and we'll check to see if D5 up here, we need to make that absolute. So that continues to look to D5 as we copy this down. To see if it equals weekly, we'll put that in quotes. If it does, we're going to take the month before us and add 7 days. If it doesn't, we'll take an if. We'll take a look again at D5 and make that absolute to see if it equals biweekly. If it does, then we'll take the period before, the date before, the previous date, and we'll add 14 to it. If it doesn't, then we'll take an if statement again, and we'll look up here to the value in D5, make that absolute, and we'll see if it equals monthly. If it equals monthly, then we'll use eDate, look at the previous date, and we'll increase it by 1 month. If it doesn't, we'll use our if statement. Look again up to monthly, make that absolute. Set that equal to quarterly. If it equals quarterly, then we'll take eDate, use the previous date, and add to that 3 months. And finally, if it's not weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, then it has to be annual. That's the only other option we have. And so we'll take eDate of the previous month and increase that by 12 months. And then we will balance our parentheses for the if statement. There's the last one. Press enter, and we have our value. And of course, this value is blank, so we're getting a blank here. We won't see that value until we complete this formula. To calculate the loan balance, we need to determine a few things in this function. First of all, we need to see if the loan's already paid off. So we need to look up here and see if the previous balance is blank. If it's blank, then it's paid off. We just put a blank in here because we're going to copy this down 2,600 rows to allow for 50 years of weekly payments. Now, if it's not blank, if it's still in service, then we need to look up here to see if we just made the last payment. In other words, is this 0? If it's 0, then we need to put our first blank in here because we're done. If that's not the case, we need to look up here and see if the amount that we owe is more than our monthly payment amount plus any extra payment, or less than or equal to our monthly payment amount and any extra payment. If it's less than or equal to that, we need to pay the amount we owe. If it's equal, we'll just make a regular payment. If it's less than that, we need to just pay off the balance and then set that cell to 0. Otherwise, it's just a regular periodic payment. We just make our payment and reduce the balance and continue. So we have to use if statements to check for those various conditions. So let's go ahead and start with an if. First of all, we'll look to the value above us to see if it equals a blank. If it equals a blank, then it's a blank. Next, we're going to use the round function to round the value above us to 2 digits, just to be sure, behind the decimal. And then we're going to check to see if that is equal to 0. If it is, then the previous period paid off the loan, so this is our first blank. If it isn't, we need to look at the value above us and increase it by the periodic interest amount. So we'll do 1 plus our periodic interest amount, which is in G3, and I have to be sure to set that to absolute. And then we need to check to see if it's greater than or equal to the absolute value of D9. If it is greater than or equal to the absolute value of D9, if it is greater than or equal to the absolute value of D9, which is the amount that we're paying each month, then we want to go ahead and apply a payment. And we want to apply a payment against that new loan balance, so we have to calculate that again. So we'll go ahead and say if that is true, then once again, we'll calculate our loan balance by taking the value above and increasing that by the periodic interest rate. Then we'll go ahead and apply our payments. So we'll add to that our monthly payment amount, which we have to make absolute, and then any additional payment amount we might make, which is found right here in cell H16. I have to use my right arrow to cursor over because you can see the formula is on that cell and it's hard for me to get to it. I could have placed my cursor here and then use the down arrow to move down into that cell. That happens sometimes. So if it's greater than or equal to the absolute value of D9, then we're going to go ahead and accrue the interest and make the payment. If it's not, then we assume that we pay off the balance and that we don't owe anything here, that the new loan balance is done. And we balance our parentheses. There we have it. Press enter and we're in good shape. To calculate the next payment number, we simply use an if statement to check with B6 to see if this period's in use. So if it's a blank, if it is a blank, we're just going to put in a blank. If it isn't a blank, we're going to take the previous payment number and increase it by 1, adding a new payment number. Calculating interest paid is similar. We're going to check to see if the period's in use. Check again with B16 to see if it's equal to blank. If it is, it'll be a blank. Otherwise, we're just going to take our periodic interest rate here in G3 and make that absolute. And we'll multiply that times the previous balance. That will tell us the interest that had accrued. And we'll enter that in our interest paid. Now to calculate principal paid, we have to do a few things. Of course, we have to check to see if this period's in use, but we also have to check to see if we're paying off the note and then just pay off what we owe, not make a regular payment. Or if we're not paying off the note, we need to go ahead and we've made a regular payment, so we need to count the principal that we applied to that payment. So let's do that. We'll start with if. And we'll look over here to B16 and see if that equals a blank. If it does, then a blank. If it doesn't, we'll use the if statement to look at the previous loan balance to see if it's less than the absolute value of the amount we pay. And we have to make sure that we make that absolute. If it is less than that, our payment's going to pay it off, so we don't want to necessarily make a full payment, and certainly if it's less than that. So what we want to do is make a payment that is the principal balance of the loan balance, and the way we can do that is to look up here and get the remaining balance and subtract from that the interest portion of that. That will then be the total amount. The rest is principal if it's not interest, and that pays it off. Otherwise, we want to take the absolute value of our loan balance, which is absolute, and we want to reduce that by the amount of interest that we paid, and then add to that the absolute value of any additional payments we might have made, and we would have made those in H16. I can't get there because Excel is blocking it, so I'll put my cursor on H15 and use the down arrow to move down 1. I'll go ahead and balance out my parentheses. And I have that. And the rest of these are pretty straightforward. Cumulative interest paid, I'm just going to look to see if the period's in use. If it's not, then I'm going to set it to blank. If it is, I'm going to take the interest that I paid in this period and add it to the cumulative interest for all previous periods, and that will give me my cumulative interest paid. I'll do the same with principal paid. I'll take a look to see if the period's in use. If it isn't, then I will set it blank. If it is, I'll take the principal that I paid in this period and add it to the cumulative principal for all previous periods. There we go. And now I have this. We want to copy this down to row 2614. That will allow for 2600 periods, which would be a weekly loan over 50 years, which will allow our workbook to make those calculations. To do that, I'm just going to select this row, use my autofill node, left click on the node, and then just drag down. I'll pull it down a bit and watch the numbers scroll by on the left. 500's just going by. Continue to scroll down. There goes 1,000. This takes just a few seconds. 1,500. We're going to 2614. Going down, here comes 2,500. So there we go, 2614. I'll release there. You'll notice there's nothing there because we're doing a monthly loan. So I'll go ahead and scroll back up. You can just grab that scroll bar and go back to the top, do whatever you want. But I want to see the last period of my note. Here it comes. There it is. Let's go back. You can see we reached 0. You can see that there are values in these cells. They're just indicating a blank because we zeroed off our note. Come back up here to the top. And this completes the amortization table portion of the exercise. We'll complete the rest of this in another video.